Hello everyone, my name is Stewart McPherson. I hope you all are staying safe under the current coronavirus situation. I've done a few lockdown lectures that I'm putting online. They're just homemade, just for fun, and I hope you'll enjoy them, and I hope they'll bring a little bit of colour and a bit of interest to the current lockdown situation. So this next one is on the Heliamphora, the marsh pitcher plants, which are carnivorous plants that grow on top of the Tepuy mountains of Venezuela and surrounding parts of Brazil and Guyana. These are the tepuys, the lost worlds, these so-called islands in the sky. They're some of the most spectacular mountains on Earth. They're breathtaking. I've actually done a different lockdown lecture, which you can watch, all about the biogeography of these amazing plateaus and about the wildlife and the stories of their discovery. But this is where the majority of the Heliamphora live. Just to put it a little bit in context before we look at the different Heliamphora species, there's about 100 of these lost world mountains. Not all of them, but most of them have Heliamphora species on them. And each Heliamphora species has evolved to a particular plateau or a group of plateaus, exactly like on the islands of the Galapagos Islands and the Galapagos chain. So the biogeography of these islands, the tepuys, is exactly the same as islands, basically. These are their incredible summits. They are simply some of the most spectacular places on Earth. Okay, so I'm going to look at all of the different Heliamphora species to provide a little bit of an overview for you of each of the different species and some of their unique traits and attributes so you can identify them. These Heliamphora aren't very widely distributed in cultivation still, but they're growing in popularity. And they're amazing carnivorous plants to grow. So if you grow Nepenthes or Sericea, they're well worth a go at growing them because they're wonderful plants. So this first species, we'll do them in alphabetical order. This first species is arenicola. This one has only ever been seen a couple of times, and it grows within patches, sandy patches, within the cloud forest below the sides of the eastern tepuys. So it's not a summit species. It grows in dense vegetation. It's relatively little known. So say it's only been seen a few times, but it goes with stegolepis in warmer, more lowland conditions down in the lowlands here. Here's a few shots. The next species is called Sericea, Heliamphora Sericea, which it means waxy because the interior of its pitchers is waxy. This one occurs on the Neblina Massif, across on the borderlands between Venezuela and Brazil. It produces very, very distinctive pitchers that are totally hairless on the inside. Most Heliamphora have hairs on the interior. These ones don't, and they have this waxy sheen. But other than that, it's a relatively little-known species as well. These are some of the very few photos that have ever been taken of it. But it can form nice big clumps, like here. These images were very kindly provided by Andreas Wisterber and Joachim Nertz, so thank you to them for these. The next species is Heliamphora chimantensis from the Chimante Massif. It occurs mainly in the centre of the Chimante Massif, and this species is unusual in that it forms massive colonies. Each clump can be 8 meters, 10 meters across. It divides from the base and forms a huge, solid mass of pitchers. And these are these are certainly decades old, and I suspect they're probably centuries old, the really, really big ones. Interestingly, when you go and see them in the wild, you'll notice that the middles of the pit, when the clumps get to about 10 meters, the middles start dying. I have no idea why, but they start dying from the center outwards, and eventually they form like a ring of growth points, which then breaks down into different clumps. Then the process repeats again. So they produce very, very little seed in the wild. They seem to reproduce primarily through this bizarre, unique budding method from the base to form these huge clumps. It's a very beautiful plant. The pitchers can grow quite big, typically 35 centimeters or so, and they have very strong nectar scent. If you're downwind of these clumps, you can definitely smell them. There's a giant clump there just so you can get a bit of a perspective of how big they can be. And you can spot them from the air very easily from a helicopter. Okay, the next species is a lowland species called Heliamphora ciliata, which is known from just one small wetland habitat in the Grand Sabana. Just one small area, and that's it. Nowhere else known from in the world. Just one small lowland area where it grows also amongst stegolepis plants in this grassy wetland. It's not known from any of the tepuy summits. So if you cultivate this one, it's probably worth keeping it a bit hotter and a bit more humid and wet. It's called ciliata because it has these strange hair-like structures on the back of the nectar spoon, and on the interior of the pitcher it has short inward pointing spines. It's a very nice plant. The next one is Heliamphora collina. This species was discovered and named only relatively recently. It grows on the shoulders beneath the Los Testigos mountains. The Los Testigos means the witnesses in Spanish. There's a series of beautiful plateaus that form a chain, and this species grows on the common base of these mountains between the summits. I did an expedition to Tari tepuy, and it might also occur on Tari on the sides of the mountains. I spotted some, but I wasn't able to completely identify it. But anyway, it's distinctive for it has a very small, uniquely shaped nectar spoon, and is similar to Heliamphora folliculata as well. Okay, so this next species is Heliamphora glabra. This one occurs on the Ilium massif, and it grows in a very harsh environment. It generally grows amongst other vegetation and can produce beautiful bouquets of pitchers. Many of these Heliamphora have their pitchers opening bright yellow. They turn to red or purple as they age. This is what they look like, often cowled amongst each other in these windswept, water-lashed environments. A very, very, very extreme habitat. And so you can see how they grow, often together like this in clumps. This is what the pitchers look. They often really are cowled together, and they often bend at the middle and sort of form a very tight cluster. And this is some of the pitchers there, what they look like together. The next species is Heliamphora exappendiculata. This species is very unusual because it has a nectar spoon that's actually formed into the back of the pitcher. People often call it a nectar bubble, and you can see here why, because it forms this sort of bubble-like structure within the back of the pitcher. This plant occurs across the plateaus of the Chimanta Massif, and also a Prada tepuy north of Chimanta, and it's the only Heliamphora to seems to have really adapted to shady cliffside conditions, and it really loves growing on cliffs in quite shaded conditions. Interestingly, every single plateau that you visit where it grows, it's a bit different. So these ones further north in Chimanta Massif are much broader, fatter, and they have a much bigger nectar spoon at the back than the ones that you saw earlier. They're from Amuri in the south of the Chimanta Massif. And there's another beautiful red form. I think that was photographed on a Prada, and out in the open they get this beautiful red coloration. Gorgeous plants. This next species is Heliamphora folliculata. This grows on those Los Testigos mountains, on the summits, and you hear this is the Los Testigos chain, and each one again is like an island in the sky. They're incredibly dramatic and incredibly spectacular, and they just hang there up in the clouds, and the Heliamphora live on the summits of them. Again, like several of the other species, they often open bright yellow, then turn red or even purple as they age. Oh, and that's shown even better here. This next species is Heliamphora glabra. Heliamphora glabra, and in this one you can really see that the change of the leaves. The opening ones are yellow, they turn red, and then even almost purplish black as they age. The black stuff on the next spoon actually is a soot mould, which many Heliamphora seem to get as the pitchers age. Heliamphora glabra also occurs in the lowlands. This is beneath the prow of Roraima. These jungles are very little explored near the prow of Roraima, so no one really knows how widespread it is down there, but it definitely does occur there, as you can see in these photos. It also occurs on the summits of many little plateaus, like Weasipu, the little plateaus near Roraima, and it often there grows in pretty dense vegetation. It's a very, very, very tough species, and it can survive in a lot of conditions, from exposed to pretty heavily vegetated. and it can get really big. It can get one of the biggest of all the Heliamphora, easily 30-35 centimeters in shaded conditions. This next one is Heliamphora heterodoxa. This one grows primarily in the lowlands, or exclusively in the lowlands, but it also does occur on the shoulder of tarry tepuy beneath the plateau surface. It is very widespread in small areas where it occurs. It's a very patchy distribution in the savanna, but it can be very abundant in the small areas where it does occur. And it's quite distinctive because it has pitchers with really large nectar spoons. So if you do grow this one, keep this one quite warm, because this is again another lowland species. The term lowland is relative because the areas beneath the tepuy summits can still be 1,000 to 2,000 meters in elevation. So that term should be used with a bit of caution there, because it is a bit relative. You'll notice that the nectar spoons are normally really big. They're almost like helmets on Heliamphora heterodoxa. But this species has a tendency, this isn't a stable characteristic, but every now and then plants can produce really weird flat nectar spoons. This just happens sporadically. As far as I'm aware, there's not a clone of this species that does this. They just happen randomly like this. And sometimes quite often on the same plant you can have many pitchers, but then it'll revert to producing normal pitchers again. But it's quite an interesting trait. The next Heliamphora is Heliamphora aespadar. This plant occurs also on the Neblina Massif between Brazil and Venezuela, and it produces unusual pitchers that are hairy on the outside and very hairy on the inside too. It's only been seen a few times and has been very little photographed, but here's some shots of it. The next one is Heliamphora huberi, also from the Chimanta Massif. It's mainly known from Aquapan and Amuri tepuis in the Chimanta, but it was named after the botanist Otto Huber. And while it does look similar to other species, it's quite distinctive because it has a very helmet-shaped nectar spoon with a point at the top. And often the pitchers can develop these beautiful veins. They're quite faint, they're always faint, but it can have lovely veins like that. The next one I have to say is my personal favourite. This is Heliamphora ionacei. It occurs in a very, very small area between Iliu and Traman massifs. The plateaus of Iliu and Traman on the Iliu and Traman massif. It can produce traps well over 35 centimeters, and they're very clear, very distinctive because they have a very flared infundibular funnel shape to them, and they have beautiful coloration, beautiful pinks and purples, particularly when they grow in sunlight or in openings in the vegetation. They're very tolerant plants, and they can grow in really dense shade as well. But in good light, they develop long spine-like hairs on the interior of the pitcher that emanate from bumps, and you can really see the bumps clearly. These prevent bugs from escaping. Bugs will fall down inside the trap, then are presented with a wall of spine-like hairs when they try and escape. So it's very, very difficult for bugs to escape. Here's a close-up of those spine-like hairs. They're pretty difficult barrier for an insect to overcome. This next one is one of the most beautiful of all of the Heliamphora. It's called Heliamphora macdonaldae. I actually rediscovered this one with two colleagues. It hadn't been seen since it was first discovered many, many, many decades ago. And people had sort of forgotten what it was and thought it was the same as Heliamphora tatii. But we landed on a plateau called Cerro Duida and found these beautiful plants. And they're very distinctive because they have gorgeous veins all across the interior of the pitchers. This is very, very distinctive. The pitchers are also glabrous, they're also hairless on the inside, except a very distinctive ring of hairs just around the opening. You can see it in this photo. But other than that, they're glabrous, they're without hairs on the interior of the pitcher opening, except at the waterline. There's normally a ring of pitchers in the bottom inside the pitcher as well, to keep in prey. There's a shot of that ring of hair around the pitcher opening edge. These plants grow, they form almost like a rhizome of dead, or they can form, they don't always, but they can form like a climbing stem of dead, clothed with dead pitchers. Never gets very long, it's never very big, but it's quite a distinctive feature in the wild. The next species is Heliamphora minor. This is Heliamphora minor var minor, which is overwhelmingly the most common variety of this species. It occurs exclusively on Aoyan tepuy and a couple of tiny little bit plateaus to the north of Aoyan, but basically only from Aoyan tepuy. It forms big clumps of small pitchers. It can be really, really beautiful and really spectacular, and often in very, very wet conditions in the wild. I don't think that you could really grow it like this in captivity. The water in captivity, if you try and grow it like this, it'll usually rot. That's because in the wild, the water is continually aerated with wind whipping over it, whereas in cultivation it stagnates. So I wouldn't recommend growing them like this. But yeah, you can see how they grow in the wild. There's a really incredible variety of Heliamphora minor, which was named by my friend Andreas Fleischmann. It's called Heliamphora minor var pilosa. And this one is pilose, it's hairy, because all on the exterior of the pitcher and inside it's covered with long hairs. And I think this is one of the most beautiful and the most extraordinary of all the Heliamphora. It's a beautiful plant. And I hope people get to grow this one in captivity because it's a lovely species to grow. Here's some shots of it. There's some more shots there. And the hairs probably enable insects to climb up the exterior of the pitcher and slip inside the traps where they're digested and gobbled up. The next plant is Heliamphora nibline. There was a lot of confusion concerning this plant for many, many, many years. It's only ever been seen a couple of times. I mounted a massive expedition in 2004 with two friends. We did it together, and we rediscovered this species in the end. We didn't know initially what it was when we rediscovered it, but we looked at the herbarium specimens. And if you look here, this is the type specimen, or holotype rather, of Heliamphora nibline. And if you look carefully, it has a glabra stripe going down the back of it. That matches exactly the red glabra stripe of these plants. So this is unquestionably Heliamphora nibline. There was a lot of confusion about this, but it's now crystal clear what that is. The next one is Heliamphora nutans. This was actually the very first species of Heliamphora to be discovered. It was found by Robert and Richard Schomburg in I believe it was 1884. Let me just check my notes here. I'll get it right. It was in the botanical El Dorado swamp, the El Dorado swamp, which Richard Schomburg discovered. They went back in 1841 and described it on the basis of their second expedition there. Robert Schomburg actually returned with a beautiful illustration of it here. And it's interesting because in this illustration of these plants that the Schomburg brothers found beneath Mount Roraima, they drew it with veins, but no plants like this have ever been discovered. So whether that was just an inaccuracy or whether it really is like that, we don't know. I suspect that was incorrectly added on later or something like that, because there are no Heliamphora with veins like that, but you never know. Heliamphora nutans actually is the least spectacular of all of the Heliamphora, despite the fact that it's the first one to have been found. It grows on Roraima and Kukunan, and no one has ever found the lowland swamps which the Schomburg brothers discovered. It grows generally in quite inconspicuous places, generally near rocks or next to rocks or crammed in amongst rocks. And the pictures, are often quite small. This is a big specimen of it, but usually they're not as spectacular as that. And it's not as easy to photograph as other species. It often grows amongst grass. This is photographed on Kukunan tepuy. And it often grows amongst grasses and other vegetation. It's actually quite an interesting point. Most of the plants in captivity labelled Heliamphora nutans are actually not Heliamphora nutans. These two plants here are hybrids with Heliamphora glabra, and that's what most of the plants in captivity actually are. You have to look really carefully, but the hybrids don't have the even coating of hair. Heliamphora glabra doesn't have hair on the inside. Heliamphora nutans does. So hybrids often have patchy hair, like this one here on the left, you can see, or they can have complete covering hair, but the nectar spoon has this distinctive bump like as Heliamphora glabra does. So when you get your eye into it, it's actually very clear to see which ones are hybrids and which ones are not. This, for example, is a plant in captivity, and this is definitely a hybrid. This is, it looks very much like Nutans, but it's totally hairless. You'll notice here on the interior of this big picture, and the structure of the nectar spoon isn't quite right. So this is definitely a hybrid as well. Okay, the next plant is Heliamphora parva. This one also grows on the Neblina, on Mount Cerro Neblina, on the border between Venezuela and Brazil. And Heliamphora parva was confused with Heliamphora neblina and many other species for a long time, but we showed from the specimens also that this is Heliamphora parva. We named it such. It was previously an infraspecies, a subspecies or variety, if I remember correctly. Anyway, it's very distinctive because it has velvet hairs on the exterior, has a really big flower, and it forms long creeping stems that are clothed like honeycomb with the remains of the dead pitchers. Those rhizomes normally grow along the ground, but every now and then they actually can grow upright, like this plant here. It also has a very distinctive flag-shaped nectar spoon, so that is definitely Heliamphora parva. Very distinctive plant, and it's very variable in its colour and its forms. But a beautiful one. The next one is Heliamphora pulchella. So this plant is named after the Latin for beautiful, and I think it's a very appropriate name because the pictures are gorgeous. It occurs exclusively across the Chimantensis Massif and a couple of very small plateaus nearby, and it differs from Heliamphora minor in that it has long hairs that emanate from bumps on the interior, and the back of the picture is depressed downwards normally with a different shaped nectar spoon. This is classic Heliamphora pulchella. This is what it looks like across most of its range. When it grows in shade, it can be quite a bit bigger with quite flared pitchers like this. But interestingly, there's a few unusual forms of it. On a Muri tepuy, you can find a form of Heliamphora pulchella with no long hairs at all inside. There's a very beautiful form about it. You can see here, they have like a silvery shine on the interior of the pitchers. So it's very attractive. There's also a beautiful, almost black form. The old pitchers turn almost black. And this is one point I should actually raise here. Many people grow Heliamphora in captivity in dark, shady conditions, often underneath benches. But actually, they grow on the surfaces of the plateaus, or on the tops of the plateaus and the savannas of the Guiana Highlands, 2,000 to 3,000 meters above sea level, bang on the equator. Now that is the highest levels of incoming solar radiation, insolation, light levels basically, of anywhere on Earth. So these plants get blasted with highland UV light and very, very, very high levels of normal sunlight. So I personally believe in captivity, they need to be given really strong levels of sunlight to develop these beautiful colorations and forms. And this is what this black form of Heliamphora pulchella looks like. It grows in really wet, swampy conditions, and these are what its traps can look like here. The next plant is called Heliamphora purpurescens, and this grows on the summit of Tari tepuy in the Gran Sabana. It grows in very, very, very windswept, harsh conditions. I know it can be quite a slow grower in captivity, and no doubt because of that. Tari tepuy is one of the most exposed and inhospitable of all of the tepuy summits, and you can see why. It's just a very, very exposed mountain. But Heliamphora purpurescens develops this beautiful purplish pitchers, which is where it gets its name from. One of the next species is Heliamphora saracenoides, named like the name means like Sarracenia, the North American pitcher plants. This was discovered by my friend Andreas Wisterberg, and it's an incredible discovery. And there's no other Heliamphora like this out there. It's a very, very special plant. It forms these beautiful pitchers with their unique hoods over them. Again, very, very unique, very special. It is a classic plant here. This is what they look like. And that's what the traps look like here as well. One of the next plants is one of the most unusual of all, Heliamphora tatii. This one, which was named after the very important botanist George Tate, who did a lot of exploration down in this part of Venezuela in the first half of the 20th century. This one grows on an erect stem. So the stem grows generally upright, or it can fall over and snake around, but it grows basically straight up. And the plant has a rosette of pitchers right at the top of the rosette. It's an amazing, amazing plant. Here's some shots of it here. You can just see how tall those stems can get. They can get above 2 meters. They're very unusual, very strange, very bizarre plants. I still don't really understand how the plant can hold its stem that upright, that high, especially with the wind buffeting it around. I only saw it once, very briefly. These are some of the shots that I took very briefly of it, growing on Cericea. It's a beautiful plant. The population I found were not very high. There are 1 meter tall stems, but they're sort of fallen over and were snaking through the vegetation, often covered with all the dead leaves, which you can see here. This plant, Heliamphora uncinata, is probably the most localized of all of the Heliamphora. It occurs on one single valley, on one mountain, Amuri tepuy, or rather, it's known only from those areas. Just one single area of one single plateau, in a very shady gorge, and that's the only place where it's known. The total population, there's a few hundred of them, if that, and that's it. That's all of them that are known to science. It could be elsewhere. Many of the plateau surfaces are very little explored, but as far as we know, the known population is just a few hundred individuals, and that's the entire population. It's clearly very closely related to Heliamphora exappendiculata, which you can see here on the left. So you can see the pictures of the 2 species side by side. Okay, last but not least, we've got a couple of unnamed possible new species. This plant grows on Angasima tepuy. It's known as Heliamphora spec Angasima, and it's really similar to Heliamphora heterodoxa, but it is different. It's very kind of hard to quantify why it's different. It's in the Heliamphora heterodoxa purpurescens group, but it is different, and it's a summit species, unlike Heliamphora heterodoxa, which is a savanna one. Here's a shot here. The next one is Heliamphora spec acopan, obviously from acopan tepuy, and this too is very similar to Heliamphora heterodoxa. Like Heliamphora heterodoxa, it can produce flat nectar spoons. It doesn't always, but it can. It often has these tiny little nectar spoons relative to the size of the pitchers. Again, it is different from Heliamphora heterodoxa. It's not very easy to define exactly how, but it is different. So another one there you can see. And last but not least, some Heliamphora hybrids. So there are many, many, many places where multiple Heliamphora species grow together. Many Heliamphora grow on just one mountain or a few mountains, but the ones that grow on a few often overlap. Or, in some cases, you'll have multiple species that occur only on one mountain, but there are more than one species on that mountain. So in those cases, you get hybrids. This is my favourite Heliamphora hybrid, and I have to say, this is my favourite photo I ever took of a Heliamphora. I just think this plant is so cool. This is Heliamphora Senevis crossed with purpurescens on Tari tepuy. And obviously you can see it's inherited those giant nectar spoons from Heliamphora Senevis as well, which is really cool. There's a close-up shot of it there. It's such a beautiful plant. Really, really nice one. This is Heliamphora chimantensis crossed with purpurescens. You can see the veins of chimantensis coming through with the form of purpurescens. This is actually quite a widespread species in the areas where chimantensis grows on the Chimanten Massif. It's quite common. This one also is quite common, but only in a small area. This is Heliamphora elongata crossed with Ionaceae, and you'll notice it kind of looks like Ionaceae, but it doesn't have the long hairs of Ionaceae, and it has a different shaped nectar spoon. This is definitely a hybrid. So there you have it. We've seen all of the Heliamphora species, these amazing pitcher plants of the lost world mountains of Venezuela, the Tepuy Mountains. I really hope you've enjoyed seeing this incredible genus, and I really hope you can grow some of these amazing plants at home. I hope you stay safe and take care, and look after yourselves in the coronavirus, and hopefully lockdown will be ending soon. Thanks for listening.